Our next guest is the team Entangled Others. The team is the shared studio practice of artists Philipcam McCormick and Sophia Crespo. Their speech title is Artificial Biodiversity. Please join me in welcoming Entangled Others.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Let us just share our presentation here. So I'm Felicon and this is Sophia, and together we form the artistic practice Entangled Others. So we'd like to talk a little bit today about our work and more specifically some of the reflections that underlie it. So a question we often ask ourselves is, what is beauty? And where does that beauty emerge in the work? Is it the mathematical ratios, the composition itself that is the underpinning of beauty? Or, as you know, we work with AI and deep learning, does the beauty stem from the data set itself? Is it the images and the curation of the images where the beauty emerges? Is that already before any deep learning process takes place? Is that where the beauty lies? Or perhaps on a more conceptual level, maybe beauty is in the image itself, in the pixels, because each pixel is an array of numbers. And is it that sum of all these numbers that is the beauty? Is that where beauty comes from? Or again, maybe it's the process itself. I mean, this may not look very beautiful at first glance, but most of our time is spent looking at what you see there, at this kind of running lines of terminal code. But this is a process that can take days, weeks, months, but that leads to the visual results. And is that the beautiful part? Is it like, you know, almost akin to land art, where the process is part of the beauty? Or is it in the way that deep learning and how the functions of neural networks are built upon mimicking how neurons actually work in the physical mind? Is it this mimicking or inspiration from the natural functioning of the mind that makes this somehow the beauty of it? Is it in its, you know, source of inspiration in the natural world? For us, a lot of our work, no matter where we think beauty lies or may not lie, we see the way we work as a means of enacting a meditation upon the subjects that inspire, captivate, and drive us. So for us, this is ecology and nature is our primary focus. To work with deep learning is to become, you know, aware of one's focus and to, you know, curate a data set, to collect and say that this is relevant to me, this isn't relevant to me, this is what I'm interested in, this is what I'm not. And then we give this data set away, you know, we send it in a sense into the layers of the neural network, and it takes maybe days or weeks or months again. And finally, we end up with a trained model that allows us to then, you know, explore the outputs of this model to encounter some kind of essential representation of the original data set. So from this process as a whole forms kind of a meditative process in itself, where we can, you know, take a subject, be it, for example, jellyfish, squid, trees, ecosystems, and we can focus on meditating upon that, to become more aware of how our own biases, you know, affect which images, for example, if it's images that we find relevant to this subject and data set. So do we exclude ugly jellyfish? Or is there such a thing as an ugly jellyfish? How do you decide what is a jellyfish to include, for example? Like, what is the jellyfishness of jellyfish to me? And this becomes a process of awareness. And at the same time, then we encounter in a more distilled essential form in the outputs again. So, Sophia often talks about this in terms of an early encounter with jellyfish.
Yeah, at an early age, I had this experience with jellyfish where I saw a digital jellyfish that really scared me when I was a child. And that somehow triggered a fascination with the textures and the look of the jellyfish. And as an adult, I found myself making art and using those textures to make my art. So sometimes one of the things that this leads me to ask myself is if all art made by humans is kind of a reshaping of impressions or data that we absorb through biological neurons. And one of the questions that kind of always breaks my brain in a way is trying to imagine a color that I've never seen before. That kind of pushes me to the very boundary of my imagination. I can only imagine colors or color combinations based on those spectrums, or that part of the spectrum of light that I've been able to perceive before. And even though there is a wider spectrum of light than what I'm able to see, I can't envision what that looks like. But we do know that there, or at least we assume that there are other creatures that are able to see more of that light spectrum since they have more photoreceptors. And sometimes I envy them a little bit. So ultimately, all these things led us to the question of how can artificial neural networks teach us something about our own cognitive processes, just from at a very abstract level, not directly trying to model biological neuron, but just from a higher perspective. And yeah, one of the goals, or one of kind of like the starting points of our work, was extracting the visual essence of a jellyfish, for instance, or nature. What does jellyfishness look like? Or what does natureness look like? And one of the researchers that has been kind of talking about this and researching this has been Aaron Hertzman in his paper about visual indeterminacy in GAN art. And there he argues that visual indeterminacy isn't something that started with generative art. He mentions that it's something that artists have already been exploring before, the space of a semantic disruption, or like a promise of semantic stability, that denies an easy or immediate identification.
And I think this is quite important to explore as artists, because when we look at exactly its indeterminacy, which often, characterizes a lot of the works we produce, it also has a very important aspect to it in that it tells us a lot about the stories that we have as humans, the stories that color how we interpret the world. So how we interpret what is natural or artificial, what is, healthy or unhealthy, and so on. And for us, a lot of this is exploring, like, how is digital, in the digital realm, which, because we are digital artists primarily, how do our own stories shape how we interpret what happens in the digital realm, and how can we use the digital space to explore changing that and stretching that experience of natureness, of nature, from starting within the digital context where so many now reside. This neural zoo is Sophia's project, so I'll let her speak a bit about that.
Yeah, this is the project where it kind of began for me, this exploration of jellyfishness and kind of this rearrangement, or digital rearrangement of nature. And one of the main protagonists of this was the jellyfish, as mentioned before. But then that also carried on with different sea creatures like sea anemone and coral, and also way more creatures. This is kind of a series that I've been working on already for 3 years, so there are lots and lots of creatures in there. But this later on led me to the question of how did humans see nature before digital cameras appeared, and or even cameras. How did we document nature before that? And I realized that there were two main ways of depicting nature before cameras. So one of them was through illustration, and the other one was through collecting direct specimens, for example, botanical specimens. And that led me to work on a series of kind of extracting the patterns of how nature was depicted and illustrated before that. And yeah, that kind of opened up a new world of how we categorize nature, how we systematically arrange it in a way that makes sense to us. And we also kind of impose discrete units of nature, like this is a fish and these are all fish, but maybe those fish don't exist in the same ecosystem. It's just us that we choose to categorize them in that way. That makes it easier for us to study them. So yeah.
So for the last couple of years now, we've been collaborating. Sophia introduced me to AI and in that sense. And we started this shared practice for our art called Entangled Others, where we focus in depth on artificial life, nature, ecology, and these topics, and explore how they are represented in digital. And from one of our early discussions, which sort of like led to this collaboration, was taking the idea of neural zoo and bringing it into a third dimension, sort of. So this is where this project Artificial Remnants began, where we started by generating individual species of neural insects, basically taking a publicly available open data of insects and then starting to explore generating them along with their texture, so to speak, and anatomical descriptions and names. So we started this exploration as a way of like trying to sort of see how can we generate artificial life forms with the help of neural networks, and what can they tell us about what's available as a data set to begin with. So we also wanted to explore parallel with seeing how the available data can become new forms, but also how can we start to explore to create spaces for creating new kinds of interaction with the natureness, to allow specimens of non-human, or rather, as we prefer to say it, the more than human. How can we use these technologies to create experiences wherein you have in this digital space, which we often think of, as a very human space, how can we start to sort of seed it with artificial life forms that, and create experiences that you can have an experience, for example, with the help of augmented reality, of something, insect-like, without necessarily having that immediate barrier of revulsion that often occurs if you encounter a cockroach on the street, for example. Very many people have an instinctual reaction to that. But what we found was that we could explore having encounters with these insectile creatures. Because they exist in the digital space, it opens up for a different kind of emotional experience, a positive one potentially, which we hope in turn can be, utilized to help us also reshape the stories we tell about, the very different from us, others, the creatures that we cannot resonate as easily with, like mammals. And this is, of course, an ongoing exploration where we've also worked a lot with trying different ways of presenting and creating interactions, from augmented reality to fashion, and to see how can how can we work with artificial life as a way of building bridges and creating, connections to nature rather than having it as some kind of replacement or alternative to nature. So we try to create more and more hybrid encounters and explore this. So this is an ongoing research process for our studio, but we don't have any final answers at all. So please, this is really just like views of our ongoing artistic research here. And while specimens were where we started, what happened with this pandemic was that we started to realize the importance of community. When you're sitting at home, stuck at home for a while, you start to sort of understand the importance of community and connecting and relationships. So we started then to take a slightly different direction within this and started to look at ecosystems as a whole, because an ecosystem is inherently social in the sense that all constituent beings in an ecosystem have a relationship to one another of some kind. They exist in connection with each other. So we started to ask ourselves, how can we dream up new ecosystems? And can doing so help us understand the concept of always like existing in that relationship to another? So with that in mind, we then sort of started, looking closer at the definition, and it very quickly became very interesting for us to look at coral reefs, because coral reefs are, in a sense, almost like an archetypal example of an ecosystem. And at the same time, they're a very small percent of the oceans, but they have such wide-ranging of a reach and consequence for biodiversity within the oceans. So they are, a crucial ecosystem. So they really example like, they show us how like no one creature is like the core component. You can't say that this piece of coral is the core of the reef, but it is the interwoven whole of all these species. And at the same time, we also found that it was quite an interesting challenge for us because we have so little data about these. When we started to like explore generating, with the help of neural networks, new 3D models of corals, crabs, etc., we realized like from like the open data from research institutions and so on was very small. So in the case, if you see here with these coral specimens all lined up in a grid, we had to have the help of a fellow artist, Joel Simon, who helped us with genetic algorithms to generate more coral specimens so that we would have a sufficient data set to train a neural network on. So already here you can see that how the available data we have is not nearly enough to actually represent or, in a sense, regenerate an actual coral reef. We can only, in a sense, like a very flat copy of it, so to speak. And this was really quite fascinating to me because it showed us like the limits of our mundane space of that representation space, representational space. Why on earth would we dream up a new ecosystem? I mean, aren't coral reefs great? Yes, they're great. That's clear. But in dreaming up, we are both engaging with an ecosystem which is very inaccessible to most people and perhaps should stay, quite inaccessible because of their sensitive and delicate nature. But to dream up a new ecosystem is to tell a story. So, when we tell a story about something, in our telling of this story, we have to confront, we are confronted by what we know, what we believe, and what we don't know. And for us, as we mentioned with the data, we very quickly reached, in a sense, the limits of the coral reef's presence within the digital. So for us then, creating this, these specimens of coral life, of coral reefs, from jellyfish to crabs to corals to shells, etc., it was at once both, mirroring our human space representation, our mundane representation as well, but at the same time also allowing us to explore how can we, create a new presence within the digital. So, and of course, as we talked before about what is an ugly jellyfish, well, if we look at the data available of jellyfish images online, there is, of course, even before we, collect that and train a neural network with that, all that data is, already in some ways pre-filtered by human beings. I'm not sure people post pictures necessarily of things they find ugly or unlikable. They often choose, their best images. So we already are, somehow like skating on thin ice in terms of like objectivity. In fact, I think for us, we've entirely abandoned any pretense of objectivity, even if we are working with neural networks, which often are thought of somehow non-human, or in the sense that they can, be objective somehow. And I think rather we see more and more with the data that this is, something very, very subjective. So this lack of data, and having to, collaborate with others to generate additional data tells us a lot about the presence we have and what we can, expect from that. So we've now been exploring again these representations of that, and these ecosystems we've generated exist always for us in terms of our artistic practice as digital physical hybrids. So we often, now can generate with the help of neural networks, colorful, living, animated ecosystems. Even if they cannot match the diversity of the real world, they still have their complexity of life. But when we then bring them back down into sculptural form, they again somehow manage to lose a dimension of, of motion, of life. And for us, this has been quite interesting because this has reversed a lot of the initial challenges, which was to, bring a sufficient quality or animation into the digital. And now we have this this interesting aspect that, the physical becomes, in a sense, has different qualities than the digital, that we are, the digital now has its own autonomous qualities beyond what we would expect, perhaps. And of course, as we work now, both, with hybrids of sculpture and digital works, it's become more and more important for us to focus on biomaterials and ways of working more, sustainably with the real world. And this is another ambition of our practice, one that I don't think we can ever say that we've gotten far enough with that yet, but it's an ongoing iterative process where we try to constantly see how can we, make our impact softer. And we had the luck with this one Beneath the Neural Waves project to collaborate with Knife Factory, a laboratory in Spain. And they use the discarded pips from olives, a byproduct of olive oil industry and so on. And they create these fantastic bioplastic materials that can be, reused indefinitely. So at the end of this exhibition, they could be entirely recycled and repurposed, losslessly. And that was, for us, like an important step in that direction of working in that way. And finally, another line of storytelling research has been our latest sort of project, Hybrid Ecosystems. So here we take the starting point in pre-trained data sets and pre-trained models that, have a wide representation of the natural of our human world. And we try and bend and twist them and push them to create representations of potential futures. Because one thing that's very important with this storytelling, of creating all this artificial life, isn't to, create a novel experience in the digital, but also to act as, a way of stimulating imagination and to help us by, trying to counter this crisis of imagination we often face these days by, creating imagination aids, images that help us perhaps, recognize or see the potential for different kinds of futures where we can have more hybrid overlapping of our world with the physical and digital, because the digital world absolutely behaves very much like its own ecosystem, and it is actually entwined. You can't really see the natural world and the digital world as separate. They are thoroughly entwined and interacting with each other. And therefore, if we are to look at it from that point of view, being able to imagine and see the potential for a harmonious balance in that ecosystem as a whole, between the digital, the physical, between us and them, the modern human and us, we need to be able to explore visual representations and try and build an aesthetic vocabulary or representational vocabulary for a hybrid future, one that, can allow us to see the world and see the potential in the world. Because I think like technology won't save us, and not by itself. I think we need to be able to imagine and then, manifest these different futures to life. And that's a lot of what our work is about. So thank you so much for having us. And of course, as you know, we do like to be we focus on entanglement. So we're always, you know, open to new dialogues and collaborations. And please, yeah, thank you so much.
If I may say something, you started with the word beauty, and again, beauty is visual, but not always. It could be also, beauty can be found in the relationship between things. In nature, we encounter beauty, and we don't know why it happens. We have no idea where it came from, but we appreciate it on the basis of sometimes physical beauty, because it looks beautiful, like a flower, but also from the function. It functions very well, so it's beautiful because it abides to the purposes of what it is supposed to do. And that's a very important, I think, concept. But again, as an artist, because, you know, we're talking nature now versus you making nature, I mean, not really nature, but this artificial nature, using a tool that we already have established that has a little bit of a black box where you are not exactly aware of the consequences of what you do, because there's a distance in between what you want to do and what you get. So my question is very crucial, because you are hands-on, you're doing things. So my question is, how much control do you have over the product of what you're trying to do? In other words, do you do something and then when you see it, you make up a story out of it, or you actually want to do something, so you adjust the data in such a way to come up with a story that you in advance want to do? Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. I think I can only speak for myself, of course, but I see it as a bit of a mix between those two. So I really like the artist Anne Riddler's comparison between AI art and land art, you know, in the sense of going out into the landscape, seeing what you can collect and how that arranges into new ways, and having that sort of potential for serendipitous discovery. And I think like some of what we do is definitely that, to, you know, explore outputs and be hopefully surprised positively by them, and to recognize within that, just as Vera Molnar, you know, very nicely pointed out once about the importance of randomness, because randomness allows us to be confronted with a wide variety, a wide diversity. And from there, you know, we can say that this here interests me, but this doesn't. So I will focus on this now. So in one way, we can use that distance, as you mentioned, as a way of creating space for serendipitous experiences. But at the same time, of course, we don't really labor under the illusion that we are, you know, somehow separate from the data that we feed it with. You know, the data sets we curate and feed into are very much shaping the outputs. So we have that, you know, responsibility in the sense that, you know, the outputs that come from the neural networks trained on data sets we've curated is very much our own outputs. So, and
I think when we started doing this work, we didn't have that much control. It was more of a random process. But with time, we were able to understand or gain more of an intuition of what, if I do this, this is going to happen. And we can kind of anticipate, based on how the tool works, what it will do given a certain data set and certain set of parameters. But on top of that, there is every time more and more tools that are emerging that allow artists to have more of a control. Like to say, you know, I want this jellyfish to be in this part of the picture. I want it to be in the top corner. And yeah, that was something like when I started, I had no idea how to do that. All I could do was generate an enough amount of variation that I would kind of go through each of them and see if I could get the kind of arrangement that I wanted to get, or that looks visually interesting to me. So that's also part of the meditative process that Felican mentioned, that it is interesting going through all these variations and seeing new arrangements that maybe weren't initially something that we thought would happen or that we imagined would happen. But yeah, like it also kind of like it changed the way that we create. Before, I think I was used to 3D rendering or being able to design an image by hand and having control over what happens where in the picture, how the composition guides the eye. But with these tools, I learned more to kind of filter and curate a data set, curate a set of outputs, and choose how I use the parameters to guide between those or kind of mediate between input and output.
So who is the entangled others? Who is the others?
The others are all those that we are entangled to and that we don't directly see the link. We exist in relationship with a lot of the world in a way that we don't, it's an invisible link, it's an invisible connection. And yeah, I think we wanted to kind of talk about what we refer to as the non-human or the otherness.
So it's anybody but you.
Well, no, it's everyone and us, I think.
I mean,
I
you
think
and
like
the rest of the world, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That's beautiful work. Congratulations. Thank you much.
Thank you, Felica and Sofia. Okay,